I'm Greg Guma, and this is the People's Republic. A little skepticism can be a good thing, but too much can be dangerous, destabilizing, even contagious, especially when it turns into deep suspicion and enduring distrust. At Pacifica Radio, after decades of struggle over the control of local stations and program content, it has led to hostile factions, crisis management, repeated lawsuits, and a byzantine, burdensome structure that has proven almost impossible to sustain. The latest showdown erupted on October 7th when a new executive director, John Vernile, with the apparent national board supporting him, shut down WBAI studios in Brooklyn and replaced local programs with a feed from Pacifica stations and other sources. The pretext was that the station's debts were threatening the entire network. By late October, however, the national board had reversed itself and suspended Vernile, who'd just been hired. In early November, in a court filled with WBAI backers, board members, producers, and staff, a state Supreme Court judge ruled that local programs should go back on the air. It sounds like a Hollywood ending, right? Plucky underdogs beat the stiff-necked establishment. But the station was still a financial wreck. According to NBC News, its last audit showed about $263,000 in assets, but $7.5 million in liabilities. In short, there is more to this story than a simple struggle between right and wrong, scrappy locals versus arrogant national officials. The truth is that Pacifica Radio has been at war with itself for decades, in the courts and on the streets. This is Planet Pacifica, Part 3, Identity Crisis. When I became Pacifica's executive director in January 2006, several disputes were brewing, as usual. At WPFW, it was the National Board delegate election. At WBAI, local board members were at odds over what some considered a racially insensitive remark. In Houston, activists wanted KPFT's general manager fired, and inquiring minds at all 5 major stations wanted to know, was the new executive director a breath of fresh air or an incompetent conspiracy nut? Yes, that was one of the rumors. During a staff meeting, a day before the Pacifica National Board's quarterly meeting, I finally met most of the national staff and station managers. To my surprise, these marathon weekend gatherings held on a rotating basis in New York, D.C., Houston, L.A., or Berkeley were the only times key managers or personnel actually got together to exchange ideas. At first, I just listened, but eventually I couldn't resist asking some questions. The network's most popular show was Democracy Now!, which brought in more than $2 million annually in contributions. But during the hijacked years, it had become an independent production. So was there interest in launching another national show, one that Pacifica would own and direct. Congressional elections were coming up in the fall, an ideal moment to try something new. Everyone claimed that they agreed, but I sensed reluctance. In the end, Pacifica did produce a collaborative 10-week fall series called Informed Dissent, hosted by Mitch Jeserich. According to the agenda that time, I was expected to moderate a discussion about governance and management. The distinction wasn't at all clear, and disputes over the exercise of power, in other words, over democracy versus efficiency and participation versus production, were frequent and contentious. The next day, I provided a preliminary analysis. According to the new bylaws, the National Board was supposed to ensure, that was the word, that the Foundation's purposes were fulfilled, monitor its finances and station activities, supervise its top managers, and delegate powers and duties consistent with the law. The operative words were monitor and supervise. Okay, but what about the executive director and the chief financial officer? The bylaws said that the executive director was responsible for general supervision of the Foundation and its top managers. Beyond that, I was expected to promote the mission, based on whatever powers the board decided to delegate. The financial officer's authority was more narrow. He was basically supposed to maintain the books and financial records, deposit and disperse funds as directed, and provide myself and the board with an account of transactions and the financial conditions of the organizations. For both jobs, reality was very different, but that's another story. Let's just say there was obvious confusion, especially when it came to supervision. Pacifica's emphasis on broad participation made boundaries an enormous challenge. The goal was to get things done efficiently and on schedule. It was radio, after all, yet the bylaws mandated processes that placed serious limits on managers and staff. As a result, disputes often arose about how various people and groups interpreted what was down on paper. Words were usually less important than the organization's embedded culture and values. In the end, ideology and perceptions tended to trump precedent and legal authority. During that first weekend, I also asked how staff and board saw the line between those who governed and managed. Was the board micromanaging? And if so, what would it take to change that? In Uneasy Listening, Matthew Lazar's second book about Pacifica, he used a provocative term, anarcho-feudalism, to describe how Pacifica operated. Another word I heard was balkanization, referring to the organization's tendency to divide into turfs and territories. Both suggested turf wars and the use of arbitrary authority. How did they feel about that diagnosis? I also asked whether they thought the bylaws were part of the problem and whether trust was a factor. In a poll of hands, most people answered yes to both. Finally, after noting that Pacifica managers were frequently, even routinely, under fire, I posed two final questions. How did this community really feel about leadership? More to the point, was the nature of executive authority in some ways fundamentally at odds with how Pacifica saw itself?
This is Informed Dissent, Pacifica Radio's national program looking at the issues affecting this year's midterm elections and beyond.
Where were the Muslim leaders who would call all the Muslims into the street and say, fill the streets, and if one goes to jail, we're all going to jail?
If every Muslim in this country, every Muslim just gave $10 to one presidential candidate, that would create a huge sum.
In this segment, we look at Muslim American voters before and after Bush's war. For the first time, it appears that a practicing Muslim will be elected to Congress. Minnesota State Senator Keith Ellison trounced his opponent in last week's Democratic primary for the state's 5th congressional district. The district is a Democratic stronghold, and Ellison is expected to win this November. If he does, Ellison would also be the first black candidate from Minnesota to be elected to Congress, and he would be one of only a few black lawmakers on Capitol Hill to represent a primarily white district. Keith Ellison was raised in a Roman Catholic household in Detroit, Michigan, and he converted to Islam at the age of 19. Allison Herrera from Pacifica station K5 Radio in Minneapolis recently caught up with Keith Ellison.
How are you proposing to engage the Muslim population here in the Twin Cities and at large diplomatically?
Well, I mean, Muslim Americans are loyal Americans. I mean, they love this country just like anybody does. But, they have views and opinions about how America could position itself better in the world. And I think what we need to do is to have neighbor-to-neighbor dialogue. I'd like to see more town hall forum around issues of inclusion, greater levels of cultural awareness.
The series we launched that fall involved dozens of people across the country at Pacifica and affiliate stations. A few months later, after a national board meeting in Houston, one member, Bertolt Reimer, who later became WBAI general manager, circulated a revealing email. It is not up to the board, he wrote, to micromanage the executive director, who should have the leverage to make decisions and implement them. If the board is not happy with the way the executive director implements its directives, it can decide not to renew the contract or have an extraordinary session to terminate him or her. Short of that, we should let him do his job. End quote. As the current executive director, I appreciated the sentiments, but there were at least two assumptions. One, that I actually had a contract. In fact, I had been working without one for more than a year already, and an attempt to negotiate terms had been derailed in the Personnel Committee. And two, he implied that the National Board's intent was often clear. On the contrary, there was rarely anything close to consensus. Divisions were especially apparent when the topic was must carry, the idea that some programs should be aired on all stations, like a network. But whether it was a national special, a Spanish-language news program, or a board-backed editorial, local control was a sore point. This became painfully clear when I attempted to mandate the national broadcasts of a U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee hearing. At the direction of the National Board, I had already written and read an on-air editorial about habeas corpus shortly after the passage of the Military Commissions Act in 2006 undermined this basic right. Then, in January 2007, KPFA host and correspondent Larry Bensky urged national coverage of the Judiciary Committee's questioning of Attorney General Alberto Gonzales. The senators would be quizzing him about warrantless surveillance, suspension of habeas corpus, torture, and the extension of domestic spying by the CIA and the military. Covering key hearings was a Pacifica mainstay, and this looked like a golden opportunity. As it turned out, we were right. C-SPAN ignored it. Mainstream media coverage was minimal, and the questioning was dramatic. It essentially started the process that led to Gonzales' resignation. But the reaction within Pacifica was revealing and mixed. Several board members charged that I had seriously overstepped my authority. I reminded them that the decision reflected a broad consensus and urged the board to let Pacifica act like a network. In response, Bob Lederer, a BAI delegate, said that the board hadn't specifically authorized national broadcast of the hearing. Therefore, stations should not have been required to air it, period. Other board members felt that voluntary collaboration was preferable to imposing a must-carry. One person submitted a motion saying that my action wasn't authorized and that I shouldn't impose any more programs on stations. It didn't pass, but the debate made it clear how limited the power of Pacifica's executive director could actually be, depending on the issue. There were deep suspicions about the use of executive power and doubts about what being a network really meant. Several national specials were produced during the next months, and most stations did air them. But new lawsuits were also filed, and the board ignored most of my recommendations for reorganization and programming changes, as well as repeated warnings about a looming financial crunch. When managers and national staff developed a policy to deal more strictly with obscenity violations, unpaid staff in New York almost succeeded in getting the board to block it. Local control advocates were mobilizing to protect station autonomy, and my early supporters were gradually falling away, in part because I hadn't satisfied their desire to clean house. Rather than offering me a contract, the board had decided to conduct an evaluation. The process took months and asked more than 140 people, national staff, station managers, and every national and local board member, to rate my work. In the end, most staff members chose not to participate, apparently fearing that I might retaliate. How sad and telling. About 2/3 of those who did respond said that I was doing all right, at least well enough to keep my job, but some thought I was unilateral, unresponsive, and presumptuous, especially in appointing a new general manager at WBAI. Although the comments and ratings were anonymous, it was easy to tell that most of my critics were from New York. The WBAI-based Justice and Unity Coalition wanted me gone.
Why have you brought me back to the flag factory?
I want to buy a flag.
We have hundreds of flags.
I want a really big flag.
You don't want a flag that's too big.
A flag can never be too big.
One of my favorite flags is so small you can stick it on top of a cupcake.
I want a really big flag.
How big?
As everyone knows, the bigger the flag, the bigger the patriot.